A group of 10 bikers surrounded a single man standing quietly beside his car on a remote highway stop. Their engines had already gone silent, but the tension they brought with them was louder than any noise. Leather jackets, heavy boots, and confident smirks painted a picture of dominance. They didn't rush. They didn't hesitate. They took their time, forming a loose circle around him, as if they had done this many times before. The man in the center looked completely out of place. No flashy clothing, no expensive accessories, no visible sign of status or authority, just a calm presence, standing still as the wind moved dust across the empty road. One of the bikers stepped forward, cracking his knuckles slightly as he glanced at the man from head to toe. "Lost?" he asked, his tone carrying both amusement and control. Another biker laughed behind him. "Or maybe he just doesn't understand where he is," he added. The group began to close in slightly, tightening the space around him. Their body language made one thing clear. They believed this was their territory, and anyone who entered it had to follow their rules, or face the consequences. The man didn't respond. He didn't take a step back. He didn't look around nervously. He didn't try to justify himself. He simply stood there, calm and composed, as if the situation didn't affect him at all. That silence, however, didn't go unnoticed. One of the bikers frowned slightly, taking a step closer than the rest. His voice lowered, becoming sharper. "You don't talk much, do you?" A brief pause followed. Still no reaction. The lack of response began to shift the atmosphere. What started as confidence slowly turned into curiosity. And then something else. A subtle discomfort that none of them openly admitted. Because people usually reacted in situations like this. They argued, they pleaded, they showed fear. But this man showed nothing. And that made the moment unpredictable. The bikers exchanged quick glances, trying to read each other's reactions, unaware that the calmness they were witnessing wasn't weakness, but something entirely different. Something they were about to realize far too late. What do you think is going through the bikers' minds right now? Do you think their confidence will stay the same after this moment? And why do you think the man is staying so unusually calm instead of reacting? The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, cutting through an isolated landscape where very few vehicles passed by at this hour. The sun was beginning to lower, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. Heat still lingered in, the air rising subtly from the road surface, mixing with dust that drifted with the wind. At the side of the highway stood a small roadside stop, a worn-down gas station with a convenience shop attached to it. The paint on the walls had faded over time, and the flickering light outside hinted at years of neglect. A couple of old benches sat near the entrance, occupied by a few travelers who had stopped briefly to rest. But this place carried a reputation. Among truck drivers, travelers, and locals alike, it was known as a zone where biker groups often gathered. Not officially controlled by anyone, yet somehow dominated by those who came in numbers and carried presence. On most days, you could hear engines long before seeing them. The deep rumble of motorcycles approaching would signal their arrival, and just like that, the environment would shift. Conversations would quiet down. People would become more aware of their surroundings. Some would leave early. Others would stay but keep their distance. Because here power wasn't written on signs. It was displayed through behavior. The bikers who frequented this area didn't need introductions. Their presence alone was enough to establish authority. They moved. In groups, spoke loudly, and carried an unspoken understanding that this was their space, at least in practice if not in name. There were no official rules posted on walls, but everyone seemed to know them. Avoid conflict. Stay out of attention, and never challenge the wrong people. That unspoken code shaped how people behaved in this environment. For many, it was just a stop along the way, a place to refuel, grab something quick, and leave without drawing notice. But for others, especially those who appeared unfamiliar or out of place, it could quickly turn into something uncomfortable. And that was exactly the kind of place this was. A location where first impressions mattered more than intentions, where a simple glance could be interpreted as a challenge, and where groups like these bikers didn't just pass through, They claimed presence wherever they stopped. As the man stood near his car, the atmosphere around the roadside stop subtly shifted again. Not because of noise, but because of attention. The bikers weren't just passing by. They had arrived. And now, the environment itself seemed to adjust to their presence as conversations slowed down and more eyes began to turn in their direction, anticipating what might happen next. In places like this, nothing was ever completely random. And once a group like that focused on someone, the situation rarely remained ordinary for long. The air felt heavier now, not because anything had happened yet, but because everyone could sense that something was about to. The group of bikers moved closer in a loose formation, their footsteps heavy against the ground. Their motorcycles stood parked behind them, forming a visible backdrop of power and control. Each of them carried a different expression, but one thing was common among all: confidence built from being in numbers. They had likely done this before, not necessarily in the exact same way, but situations where someone unfamiliar entered their space, and they took the lead in deciding how things should go. In environments like this, group behavior often amplifies individual attitudes. When people are surrounded by others who share the same mindset, their confidence tends to increase, sometimes even turning into overconfidence. One of the bikers stepped forward slightly ahead of the rest. He appeared to be the most outspoken, the one comfortable taking charge of the situation. His eyes scanned the man again, this time more critically. "Doesn't look like you belong here," he said, his tone mixed with judgment and superiority. Another biker chuckled behind him. From a human psychology perspective, moments like this are often driven by perceived social hierarchy. People tend to quickly categorize others based on appearance, clothing, and behavior, especially in environments where status and dominance are valued. In this case, the man's simple appearance became the basis for their assumptions. Without asking questions, they had already formed an opinion, and once that opinion was formed, they began to act on it. The lead biker took another step forward, closing the gap. His posture became more assertive, shoulders slightly raised, chin tilted upward, subtle physical signals that communicated dominance without needing words. "You sure you're in the right place?" he added, this time with a slight smirk. There was a pause. The man remained silent. No verbal response, no visible reaction, no attempt to defend himself or clarify his presence. To an outside observer, this silence could be interpreted in different ways. Some might assume hesitation, others might see it as lack of confidence. But in reality, silence can also be a form of control, a deliberate choice not to engage in unnecessary confrontation. However, the bikers interpreted it differently. In their minds, silence often equated to uncertainty or fear, and that interpretation reinforced their behavior, making them more assertive. One of them stepped closer and deliberately invaded his personal space, a common tactic in dominance-based interactions. By reducing physical distance, they attempted to increase psychological pressure. "People don't usually stand here looking like that," he added, glancing at the others for approval, which they responded to with faint laughter. This group dynamic is important to understand. Individually, each person might have acted differently, but together, their behavior aligned, influenced by mutual validation. The presence of an audience, even a small one, further reinforced their actions, as social environments often encourage people to maintain a certain image within their group. Yet despite the teasing, the smirks, and the subtle intimidation, the man remained unchanged, still, calm, observant, and that, in itself, began to create a shift. Because in human interactions, when one side doesn't react as expected, it introduces uncertainty into the situation. And uncertainty is something even the most confident groups begin to notice. The atmosphere had now shifted from casual confrontation to something far more intense. The bikers were still standing in a loose circle, but their energy had subtly changed. Their laughter had faded into shorter, less frequent exchanges. What began as a display of confidence was now slowly being replaced by curiosity, and a hint of unease they hadn't fully acknowledged yet, because the man in front of them still hadn't reacted. No arguments, no defensive words, no visible irritation. Just stillness. He stood in the same position, his posture relaxed yet upright, his shoulders steady, his breathing slow and controlled. His eyes remained focused, not on any single biker in a reactive way, but scanning the group calmly, as if assessing the situation without emotional interference. This kind of composure is rare in confrontational scenarios. Most people, when faced with pressure, tend to respond instinctively, either by becoming defensive, raising their voice, or showing visible signs of stress. These reactions are natural, human responses triggered by perceived threat. But in this case, the absence of those reactions created a different kind of tension. Silence began to fill the gaps between the biker's words. One of them shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his stance. Another crossed his arms, trying to maintain a dominant posture. But his body language wasn't as relaxed as before. Small signs, subtle movements, brief glances between group members started to reveal a shift beneath the surface. They were still in control, at least outwardly. But internally, something was changing. The human mind is highly sensitive to patterns. When a situation doesn't follow expected behavior, it creates cognitive dissonance, a mental discomfort caused by unpredictability. The bikers had expected resistance, fear, or at least some kind of verbal interaction. Instead, they were met with complete composure. That unpredictability began to register. The lead biker narrowed his eyes slightly, studying the man more closely now, not just as a target, but as an unknown variable. "Why aren't you saying anything?" he asked, this time with less amusement in his voice. Still, no response. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. Each second stretched longer than usual, as if time itself had slowed down within that small circle of tension. Even the background noise, distant vehicles passing on the highway, wind brushing against nearby objects, seemed quieter now, less noticeable compared to the focus of the moment. Another biker let out a short breath, almost as if trying to break the pressure building in the air. "This guy's weird," he muttered under his breath, though it was loud enough for others to hear. And that statement, simple as it was, reflected the growing uncertainty within the group. Because when people cannot predict someone's reaction, they begin to question their own expectations. The man, however, showed no signs of discomfort, no nervous gestures, no shifting stance, no attempt to fill the silence. Instead, he remained grounded, his presence steady, almost controlled in a way that felt different from ordinary calmness. It wasn't passive, it was deliberate, and without saying a single word, he had already begun to influence the dynamic of the situation. The bikers might not have fully realized it yet, but the balance in that circle was no longer as one-sided as they believed. Something had changed, and the longer the silence continued, the more that realization began to. As the tension continued to build, the surrounding environment began to react. What was once just a routine stop on a quiet highway had now become a focal point of attention. Nearby, a truck driver who had been resting in his vehicle slowly stepped down, closing his door with care. He didn't approach directly, but he positioned himself at a distance where he could observe the situation clearly. His instincts told him that something unusual was unfolding. At the small roadside shop, the shopkeeper, who had been casually arranging items on a shelf, paused his work. He glanced outside through the glass door, then stepped closer to the entrance, his expression shifting from routine focus to concern. Other travelers who were seated on benches began to notice as well. Conversations dropped in volume. Movements slowed. Even those who tried to appear uninterested couldn't help but look in the direction of the bikers and the man standing in the center. This is a natural human response. When people sense tension or potential conflict, their attention is drawn toward it. It's an instinctive behavior rooted in awareness and self-preservation, the need to understand what is happening in their surroundings in case it affects them indirectly. In this moment, the silence between the bikers and the man felt more noticeable than before. The bikers themselves were no longer fully focused on intimidation. Their awareness had expanded beyond the man to include the people watching them. Subconsciously, this added another layer of pressure, not just maintaining control over the situation, but also maintaining their image in front of others. One of the bikers glanced sideways at his group, then back at the man, as if trying to confirm that they were still aligned in their approach. Another shifted his stance slightly, adjusting his posture as if preparing for something, though nothing had yet been initiated. The lead biker exhaled slowly. The earlier confidence was still present, but it now carried subtle signs of hesitation, because the man in front of them still hadn't reacted in any predictable way. No anger, no fear, no attempt to de-escalate or engage, just steady silence. And silence in situations like this can create more tension than words ever could. The surrounding witnesses continued to watch, their attention fixed. Some stood still, while others leaned slightly forward, trying to catch every detail. Even the smallest movement from either side seemed amplified in importance. Time itself seemed to slow down. Not literally, but perceptually. Every second, stretched, filled with anticipation. People often describe moments like this as feeling heavy or charged. And that's because the human brain becomes highly alert when it detects uncertainty combined with potential conflict. It begins to process multiple possible outcomes at once, which makes the present moment feel longer and more intense. The bikers, despite their numbers, were now operating under that same psychological pressure. And the man at the center? He remained unchanged, still composed, still observant, still not reacting, which only deepened the mystery for everyone watching. Because at this point, the question was no longer just about what the bikers would do next. It was about why the man hadn't done anything at all. And that unanswered question was slowly building toward a moment that everyone could feel was approaching, but no one could predict. Part 6. The break and reveal, escalation, plus identity shock. The tension that had been building for minutes finally reached its breaking point. One of the bikers, unable to tolerate the prolonged silence any longer, stepped forward with a sudden burst of impatience. His earlier confidence had turned into frustration, and that emotion pushed him to act without thinking through the consequences. "All right. Enough of this," he muttered, tightening his jaw as he moved closer. In confrontational situations, this kind of behavior is common. When uncertainty lingers too long, some individuals feel compelled to force an outcome. Instead of continuing to analyze or reassess, they choose action, often impulsively, to regain a sense of control over the situation. He reached out aggressively, but in that exact moment everything changed. The man in the center moved. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was incredibly precise. A single controlled motion. The biker's advance was interrupted instantly, his momentum redirected before he could fully react. Within seconds, he lost balance and was brought down to the ground. There was no visible struggle, no wasted movement, just efficiency. The circle of bikers went completely silent. For a brief moment, no one spoke. No one laughed. No one stepped forward, because what they had just witnessed didn't match their expectations at all. Another biker reacted instinctively, stepping forward to support his group. But hesitation was now visible in his movement. His pace wasn't as confident as before. There was a brief pause, a fraction of a second where his brain processed what had just happened. That pause made all the difference. He advanced anyway, but the result was the same. A second biker went down. Now the energy had shifted completely. The group that once surrounded the man with confidence and dominance was no longer operating as a unified force. Instead, small signs of doubt began to appear. Some of them glanced at each other, others shifted their stance slightly backward. One or two even reconsidered their positioning around the circle. The illusion of control had started to break, and then came the moment of recognition. One of the bikers, standing slightly behind the others, narrowed his eyes as he looked more carefully at the man's face. Something about his posture, his movement, and the way he handled the situation felt familiar. Not just random, but recognizable. His expression changed. His confidence faded into realization. "Wait," he said quietly, almost to himself. He took a half step back as the pieces started to connect. "Is that Steven Seagal?" The name hit the group like a sudden shock. Everything paused. The remaining bikers froze in place, their attention shifting immediately toward the man they had just been underestimating moments ago. The tone of the environment changed instantly, not through force but through awareness, because now they understood. This wasn't an ordinary individual caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was someone with experience, training, and composure that went far beyond what they had anticipated. The realization spread quickly through the group, replacing their earlier confidence with hesitation. No one wanted to make the next move without thinking. The balance of power had shifted, not through words or confrontation, but through a single moment of clarity, and in that silence, the outcome of the situation had already begun to change. Part 7. Moral Lesson and Aftermath. Resolution plus Authority. After the revelation, the entire atmosphere felt different. The bikers, who moments ago had been loud, confident, and aggressive, now stood in silence. Their body language had changed noticeably, shoulders slightly lowered, movement slower, and eye contact less direct. The realization of who they were dealing with had created an immediate psychological shift. None of them spoke. No one stepped forward. The energy that once surrounded the man had dissolved into uncertainty. The witnesses nearby were still watching, but now their expressions had changed as well. What started as curiosity had turned into quiet understanding. Some looked at each other as if confirming what they had just witnessed. Others simply remained still, processing the sequence of events that had unfolded in front of them. The man, however, remained unchanged. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't display anger. He didn't attempt to assert dominance through aggression. Instead, he calmly adjusted his stance, as if the situation had already been resolved without the need for further escalation. His presence alone carried authority, not the kind that demands attention through force, but the kind that naturally earns respect through control and discipline. One of the bikers shifted slightly, lowering his gaze. Another took a small step backward, creating distance between himself and the center of the circle. These small actions were not coordinated, but they reflected a shared understanding among the group. The situation had reached a point where continuing the confrontation no longer made sense. The earlier energy had been replaced by caution, and, in moments like this, people often reassess not just the situation but their own behavior within it. The man finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady, and measured. Not loud, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "You don't need to prove strength by targeting those you think are weaker," he said. "Real strength is knowing when to control yourself." The words weren't delivered as a threat. They weren't meant to embarrass or provoke. They were simply a statement of perspective, a lesson. The bikers listened quietly. No interruptions, no reactions, just attention. Because in that moment, the dynamic had shifted from confrontation to reflection. No further conflict followed. The bikers gradually returned to their motorcycles, their movements now more subdued than before. Engines were started one by one, but the earlier noise and energy were gone. There was no celebration, no continued aggression, only a quiet departure. As they left the area, the environment slowly returned to normal. The witnesses began to resume their activities. Conversations picked back up. The stillness that had dominated the moment began to fade. But the impact of what had just occurred remained. For those who had seen it, the lesson was clear. Situations are not always what they appear to be at first glance. Judging someone based on appearance or assumptions can lead to unexpected outcomes, and sometimes the